Dust that bites. I've seen blood before, on hunting trips, bar fights gone too far, even the small accidental nicks that come from handling century-old steel. But I've never seen blood move. Not the way Eric's did that night. It didn't spill so much as it pulsed, thick and eager, bubbling out of him in heavy spurts that seemed to have a will of their own. The bite mark on his wrist was ragged and black, swollen in seconds, veins writhing beneath the skin like worms trying to break free. He screamed, not in pain alone, but in confusion, like his body was no longer his own. I should have called an ambulance. I should have run for help. But I couldn't move. I stood there, staring at the pottery shard lying at our feet, the spherical vessel split clean in two. 1,000 years of silence cracked open in the middle of my workshop, and from that tiny hole in its surface had crawled the thing that changed everything. It wasn't bigger than my thumb, an insect that looked too ancient to belong to this earth. Its shell was black, glossy, the kind of black that swallows light instead of reflecting it. Its wings twitched but never fully opened, and its mouth, God help me, I still see its mouth, opened sideways, jagged like broken glass. It had gone straight for Eric. He didn't even have time to scream before it sank its mandibles into his flesh. He flung it off, crushed it under his boot, and for a second I thought that was the end of it. But the real horror wasn't the bug itself. It was what it carried inside. Eric stumbled back, clutching his wrist, cursing, sweat already pouring down his face, though the room was cold. He gasped for air, eyes darting, pupils shrinking until they were nothing but pinpricks of black swallowed by red. I had seen infections before. My father lost a finger once to a rusted blade, but this was no infection. This was possession, and it was fast. Too fast. His screams collapsed into guttural moans. His legs gave out, and for a heartbeat he lay still on the workshop floor. I knelt beside him, shaking him, shouting his name, praying this was shock. That's when his eyes snapped open. They weren't Eric's eyes anymore. The whites had gone murky, threaded with blood that spread like ink in water, and when he opened his mouth, the smell that poured out was rot. Old, festering rot, the kind you find when you pry open a coffin that's been shut too long. Eric lunged. I staggered back, my chair toppling behind me, his fingers clawing at the air where my throat had been. His teeth snapped shut with an audible crack, inches from my face. For a moment, I didn't see my friend anymore, just hunger. Pure, mindless hunger. The workshop became a prison instantly. Every antique, every priceless relic around us turned from treasure to clutter. Tables in the way, boxes stacked high, nowhere to run. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a brass candlestick from the 1800s, and swung. The sound of metal hitting bone is something that stays with you. Dull, final. But Eric didn't fall. He barely staggered. That's when I knew. This wasn't Eric anymore. This wasn't a man I could reason with or help or save. The thing on the floor wasn't dead when we crushed it. It had just moved into him. And with that bite, the world as I knew it ended. I wish that was the beginning of my story. A monster in my workshop, my best friend's blood on the floor, the end of the world unfolding in front of me. But it wasn't. The truth is, that night didn't come out of nowhere. It was born from 1,000 small choices. From the life I built long before the pottery ever fell into our hands. And if you want to understand how it all went so wrong, you need to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. I wasn't born a collector. I became one the first time I held a piece of history in my hand and realized it would outlive me. I was 12, digging through the attic of my grandfather's farmhouse when I found a rusted pocket watch wrapped in a yellowed cloth. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen, but when I turned it over, the engraving was still there. To my dearest John, may time always be kind. John had been gone for decades, but here I was, staring at a gift his wife had pressed into his hands a century earlier. I remember running my thumb over those letters again and again, not caring that dust stained my fingers black. That was the moment it hooked me. Antiques don't lie, they don't flatter, they endure. Every scratch, every dent, every bit of wear is proof that someone lived, touched, and used them. In a world where people forget each other so easily, that felt sacred to me. By the time I was in college, I spent more time in estate sales than in class. Furniture, coins, blades, journals, anything that whispered of a life once lived. My friends spent their nights drinking. I spent mine on my knees in strangers' basements, holding oil lamps to corners no one had touched in decades. And I loved every second of it. That love became my life, and it led me to Eric. He was the only one who ever matched my obsession. We met at a small-town auction, both reaching for the same battered ceramic jug at the same time. We laughed, argued, and ended up pooling money to buy it together. It turned out to be worthless, but that didn't matter. From that day on, we were partners. We became a two-man crew, chasing whispers across counties, states, and borders. We slept in cheap motels, lived out of duffel bags, and crammed rental cars with whatever treasures we found. Sometimes we struck gold, like the time we pulled a genuine Roman coin from a shoebox marked buttons. Sometimes we lost everything, like the barn fire that nearly buried us both. But win or lose, Eric always said the same thing, grinning with soot on his face or dust in his hair. One day, Frank, we'll find the big one. And maybe I started to believe him. Because in our world, there was always one more attic to search, one more auction to haunt, one more relic that might carry a story no one had ever heard before. It was the chase as much as the find, the thrill of history calling out from the dark. That thrill brought us the pottery, and with it, the end of everything. Looking back now, I think the best years of my life were spent in the passenger seat of Eric's beat-up Chevy, maps and coffee cups piled on the dash, the trunk rattling with whatever relics we'd scavenged that week. Eric was always the driver. He loved the road too much to ever hand it over. Even when his eyelids drooped at 3 a.m, he'd slap his own face, crank up some old rock cassette and say, "History doesn't wait, Frank. Neither do we." I'd laugh, sip the worst gas station coffee imaginable, and let the miles roll under us. Our adventures weren't glamorous. They were dirty, exhausting, half the time a waste. But they were ours. There was the time we crawled through the basement of a collapsed courthouse in Virginia, rat droppings crunching under our boots, just to pry a Civil War bayonet out of the wall where it had been buried by rubble. Or the week we spent in Kansas chasing rumors of a trunk filled with old railway ledgers, only to find it being used by a farmer to store rusted nails. Eric laughed so hard at my face that he nearly toppled backward into a trough. But the good finds made it worth everything. I still remember the weight of that samurai tanto we discovered tucked in the false bottom of a cedar chest in New Jersey. It was perfect. Steel still whisper sharp after centuries, the hilt wrapped in faded silk. We held it like children with a Christmas gift, grinning at each other in disbelief. Eric's eyes had this glow, like he'd just touched eternity. Then there was the night in Louisiana when we broke down outside Baton Rouge. Stuck on the roadside with a trunk full of what turned out to be Spanish colonial silverware, we built a fire from scrap wood and spent the night drinking whiskey out of a dented flask, trading ghost stories until the stars blurred above us. By dawn, we were half drunk, filthy, and laughing so hard my ribs hurt. I think that was the first time I realized Eric wasn't just my partner, he was my brother. And we had close calls too, more than a few. The barn fire in Indiana still lingers in my dreams. We'd been digging through a structure so old the beams groaned if you breathed on them wrong. Eric knocked over a lantern, and in seconds the dry hay went up like tinder. Smoke choked the air, flames licked up the rafters, and for a few terrifying minutes, I thought we'd die buried under someone else's forgotten junk. We stumbled out coughing, shirts singed, coughing so hard we couldn't even talk. Then Eric looked at me, ash smeared across his grin, and wheezed out, "Guess history almost got us first." I shoved him, still coughing, and then I laughed too. Because with Eric, even near death became a story worth telling. That was Eric. Always chasing, always believing the next find would be the one. And in some strange way, I think he needed that dream more than I did. I loved the stories antiques carried, the quiet weight of their history. But Eric, he wanted something more. He wanted to leave a mark, to hold something that would prove we mattered as much as the past we chased. And maybe that's why he couldn't resist the pottery. It was him, really, who found it, who pushed us to carbon date it, who marveled at its impossible age and swore this was it, the big one. I watched the hunger in his eyes when he held it, the same hunger I'd seen 100 times before, only sharper, hungrier. One of the last real adventures we had before everything turned was in Arizona. Some collector's rumor had us chasing down an unmarked Spanish mission bell buried in the desert. We spent 2 days combing dry earth under a blistering sun, my skin peeling, Eric's lips cracked and bleeding. Of course, we never found the bell. What we did find was a half-rotted chest buried shallow under a mesquite tree, stuffed with old cavalry buttons and rusted horse tack. Junk to anyone else, but to us, it was like striking gold. I still remember Eric holding one of those brass buttons to the sky like it was a diamond, sweat pouring down his forehead, grinning so wide it hurt to look at him. That night we camped under the stars, no motel in sight, just desert wind and silence. He lay there with his hands behind his head, staring upward, and said, "One day, Frank, people will remember us the way we remember them. They'll find something with our names on it and wonder who we were." I laughed it off, tossed him another beer, told him we weren't worth remembering. But the look in his eyes stuck with me. He wasn't joking. He wanted it. Legacy, immortality, something that proved his life was more than dust and rusted metal. And then there was that winter in Ohio. We'd chased a lead about an attic filled with Revolutionary War relics, only to spend hours shivering in the cold, breathing dust while digging through moldy coats and broken trunks. When we finally found something, a powder horn carved with initials, we were so frozen we couldn't even feel our hands. Eric dragged a space heater up from the garage, and we spent the night huddled by it in that dusty attic, passing a flask back and forth, laughing until our voices echoed off the rafters. Those moments were simple, small. They weren't about riches or fame or legacy. They were just ours. And I should have stopped him. God, I should have stopped him. If I'd known they'd be the last ones before the pottery, I would have held on longer. I would have memorized every word, every laugh, every look in his eyes. Because once that sphere cracked open, once the thing inside tasted blood, those memories became all I had left of the man I called brother. It came to us the way trouble often does, quietly, almost casually, like it had been waiting all along. We weren't in some lost tomb or crawling through a jungle with shovels on our backs. No, the pottery didn't come to us with grandeur. It came in a cardboard box wrapped in yellowing newspaper, sitting in the back room of a dusty little shop on the coast. The dealer barely looked at it when he pulled it out. He thought it was a reproduction, a curiosity someone had faked decades ago. A conversation piece, he called it. The kind of thing people stuck on mantles to look cultured. But the moment I saw it, I knew better. The clay was dark, almost black, but not like any clay I'd handled before. It had this dull sheen, as though oil had seeped into it over centuries. Strange etchings crawled across its surface, patterns that weren't letters, not exactly, but suggested meaning, like a language I should have recognized but couldn't. And then there was the shape. Perfectly round, a sphere. Who shapes pottery into a sphere? Jars, bowls, urns, sure. But a ball of clay fired into stone? That wasn't for function, that was for something else. When I picked it up, the weight startled me. It wasn't hollow like I expected. Solid, heavy, with a strange balance to it. And there, almost hidden, was the detail that sealed it. In my gut like a stone. A tiny hole drilled deep into the center. A pinprick. Nothing more. Eric's eyes lit up like a man seeing fire for the first time. "This is it," he whispered, turning it in his hands as though afraid it might vanish. "Frank, this could be the big one." I felt the unease before I felt the excitement. Holding it was like holding something that didn't want to be held, like the sphere itself was pressing back against my palms. My instinct was to put it down, to leave it on that counter and walk away. But Eric couldn't. He pressed the dealer, demanded papers, origin, history. The man just shrugged, swore it came out of an old estate trunk that had been sealed up for decades. No provenance, no story, nothing. To him, it was junk. To Eric, it was treasure. By the time we left that shop, the pottery was ours. Nestled in the back seat of Eric's Chevy like a newborn, wrapped tight in the same newspaper that had hidden it from sight. I should have felt proud. A find like that could change everything for us. But as I sat there staring at it on the ride home, the unease deepened. My fingers kept brushing that tiny hole, and each time I did, the same thought repeated in my head. Something's inside, and it's waiting. At first, we treated it like any other find. We cataloged it, photographed it, logged it with the rest of our growing collection. That's what we always did. But Eric couldn't leave it alone. It started small. He kept it near him while he worked, rolling it in his palms, tracing the strange etched patterns with his fingers. When I'd ask what he was doing, he'd laugh it off, say he was getting a feel for it. But even then, I saw the way his eyes lingered on the sphere, like it was whispering something only he could hear. Within days, it stopped being a find and became the find. Eric was the one who pushed for carbon dating. Normally, we never bothered. Too expensive, too much red tape. But this time he insisted. "We have to know, Frank. We can't sit on this one." I still remember the look on his face when the results came back. He held the sheet of paper like it was scripture, his hands trembling. At least 1,000 years old, older than any of the colonial relics we'd ever dug up, older than most of the pieces sitting in museums we'd drooled over. Eric's grin was so wide it looked painful. "Do you get it? Frank, do you understand? This isn't just rare. This is history rewriting itself. We found it. Us." And maybe I should have matched his joy. Maybe I should have thrown my arms in the air, popped open a bottle, and celebrated like we always did when we struck gold. But I couldn't, because that tiny hole in the clay kept bothering me. It was nothing, a flaw maybe, but I couldn't shake the thought that the pottery wasn't meant to be sealed forever. That hole wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, A keyhole, a vent, a warning. I kept those thoughts to myself. Eric wouldn't have listened anyway. He was consumed. At night, I'd hear him in the workshop, pacing, muttering, holding the pottery up to the light, pressing his ear against it like it might whisper secrets. When I walked in once, he looked up with wild eyes, cheeks hollow, stubble dark across his jaw. He looked less like my partner and more like a man starving, and the pottery was his only meal. I told myself it was just Eric being Eric. This was the dream after all, the big one he'd chased across every backwater town and forgotten attic. Only this time, the dream had teeth, and I could feel them pressing in, sharp and waiting, every time I brushed my hand across that cold, perfect sphere. It was close to midnight when Eric called for me. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the house like a blade, urgent, breathless. "Frank, come here. You need to hear this." I almost ignored him. I'd been half dozing on the couch, a book sliding off my chest, the clock ticking into silence. But something in his tone snapped me awake. I knew that sound in his voice, equal parts wonder and terror. The sound of a man standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding whether to jump. I found him in the workshop, hunched over the pottery like a priest over holy scripture. The lamp above cast his face in hard shadows, eyes wide and unblinking, sweat plastering strands of hair to his forehead. He didn't look at me at first. He just pressed the pottery to his ear, lips parted, breathing shallow, like he was trying not to scare something off. "It's in there," he whispered, his voice cracked, moving. I blinked at him, then at the sphere. It sat heavy in his hands, dull and dark as ever. Lifeless. Just clay. My gut told me to laugh, to tell him he was seeing ghosts in the dark. Instead, I asked carefully, "Eric, what are you talking about?" His head snapped up, eyes shining like fever. "I'm not crazy, just listen." He shoved it toward me. I stepped back. My instincts screamed not to touch it, not to even get close. For weeks, I'd been telling myself the unease I felt around that sphere was in my head. Nothing more than nerves stirred up by its age, its strangeness. But now, with Eric staring at me like a desperate child begging to be believed, I felt that unease harden into something sharper. Fear. "Eric," I started, "just listen." His voice broke like glass. I took it, against everything in me. The pottery was cold, colder than it had any right to be under the glow of the lamp. My hand automatically found the tiny hole, fingertip resting against it like a key in a lock. I swallowed hard and lifted it to my ear. At first, nothing, just the thud of my own pulse and the faint rasp of my breath. Relief trickled in. I almost told him he was imagining it. Then, faint and dry, I heard it, a sound, not loud, not clear, just a whisper against the clay, like brittle leaves stirring in a box, like old parchment crumpling in someone's fist. A faint, steady rustle. Alive. I tore the pottery from my ear so fast I nearly dropped it. My stomach flipped, bile stung my throat. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls leaning in. Eric leaned forward, frantic. "You heard it, didn't you?" I wanted to lie, to shake my head and tell him it was nothing, just the house settling, my imagination playing tricks. But the truth must have been written all over my face because Eric grinned, and it wasn't relief that twisted his mouth. It was triumph. "Yes," he whispered, eyes wild. "Yes, I knew it." I stared at him, unable to speak, because the truth had rooted itself deep in my gut. This pottery wasn't just old, it wasn't just rare, it was a prison, and whatever it held was stirring. It was the third night when Eric finally said what we'd both been circling around. We sat at the workbench, the pottery between us, lamplight washing the clay in a dull yellow glow. I'd just finished listening again, pressing my ear against the tiny hole until my pulse thundered louder than anything else. But right before I pulled away, I heard it again. A faint scratch. A shift, like something brushing against the inside. When I set it down, my hands were clammy. Eric leaned forward, elbows on the table. His voice was steady, thoughtful. "What if it's a mechanism?" he said. "Like some kind of ancient rattle, a design feature. Something sealed inside to move around, make sound. A trick of craftsmanship." It was plausible. That was the worst part. I wanted to believe it. But I could see in his eyes that even he didn't. I shook my head. No mechanism keeps moving this long, not after 1,000 years. If something's still shifting in there, then... I trailed off, not wanting to finish. Eric didn't make me. His gaze slid back to the sphere, to the dark little hole. His lips pressed tight. "Then maybe it's alive." The words sat between us like a stone dropped in water, rippling outward. I swallowed hard. "That's impossible. It was carbon dated. Over 1,000 years, Eric. Nothing survives that long." He didn't look away. His voice was calm, almost quiet but certain. "Unless it's not what we think." And that was when the thought, ridiculous and terrifying, finally broke through. "An incubator of some sort," I whispered. Eric nodded slowly, eyes bright with a light I couldn't name. "Exactly. Preserved. Waiting." Waiting for what? My chest tightened. The idea clawed at me, absurd and yet too fitting to dismiss. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he'd gone too far. But the sound I'd heard still echoed in my ears, faint and dry, like something stirring in its sleep. And for the first time since we'd found it, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside wasn't just ancient. It was waiting. The word hung between us, heavier than the clay itself. Egg. I hated how easily it fit. Eric leaned closer, eyes locked on the sphere as though it might answer him. "Think about it, Frank. If it is incubating something, then what we're hearing, its movement, life. It's been preserved somehow, maybe perfectly, like amber trapping an insect. Only this is different. This is," he exhaled, almost reverent, "miraculous." I stared at him, disbelief clawing at me. "Miraculous?" "Eric, no. Eggs don't wait 1,000 years to hatch. They rot. They turn to dust. That's how the world works." But my words felt thin even as I spoke them. I kept hearing that faint rustle, that brittle shift, a sound no dust or grit could make. Eric smiled faintly, but there was no madness in it, just excitement, the kind he always carried when we unearthed something rare. We've been wrong before about what the ancients could do. Preservation techniques, rituals, things we still can't explain. What if this is one of those things? What if it was meant to last? I shook my head, though I couldn't muster the conviction to argue. And what happens if it hatches? What comes out of something sealed up for over a millennium? That gave him pause. His gaze flickered, but only for a heartbeat before he straightened his shoulders. That's what makes it incredible. We'd be the first to see it, to study it, to prove it. I pressed my palms into my thighs to keep them from shaking. I wanted to believe him, to share his awe, but I couldn't. The thought of it hatching didn't thrill me. It hollowed me out. Because if something had survived inside there for that long, then it wasn't fragile, it wasn't normal. It was something built to endure, and things built to endure were rarely harmless. Eric must have read the unease in my face because his tone softened. "Frank, this could be the find of our lives. Do you understand that? Every collector, every archaeologist dreams of stumbling onto something that rewrites what we know. This could be it." I couldn't meet his eyes. My gaze was fixed on the pottery, on that dark pinprick of a hole. It stared back at me like an unblinking eye. An egg. The thought burrowed deep, no matter how I fought it. If it really was one, then something was growing in there. Something that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Something that had waited 1,000 years in the dark, and might not wait much longer. It happened on a night when the house was so still, I could hear the tick of the clock across the room. Eric was at the workbench again, the pottery cupped in both hands. I'd stopped trying to drag him away from it hours ago. He wouldn't listen, and truth be told, I was too drained to argue. I sat on the couch, half dozing, when the sound pulled me awake. Not the faint scrape I'd grown almost used to, not the subtle shift I'd convinced myself I'd imagined. This was sharper, louder, like something clawing closer to the surface. Eric froze, every muscle in his back tightening, his head tilted, ear pressed to the hole. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I had. God help me, I had. I pushed to my feet, pulse hammering. "Put it down, Eric." He didn't move. His thumb stroked the surface as if soothing it. "It's changing," he murmured, awestruck. "Frank, it's almost ready." The words hollowed me out. Almost ready. Like we'd been waiting for this. Like we wanted it. Before I could answer, the sound came again. This time with a crack so faint it might have been mistaken for the pop of a joint or the snap of old wood. But I knew. I knew instantly what it was. I crossed the room in 3 strides. "Eric, put it down!" He shook his head, clutching it tighter. His knuckles whitened. Number, "Not now. We're about to..." The crack came again, louder. A splintering sound that vibrated in my teeth. I flinched, and Eric's eyes went wide, his lips parting in wonder. A thin line had appeared along the surface. Hairline, almost invisible, but it ran straight out from the tiny hole like a vein of lightning. I felt the air leave my lungs. Jesus Christ. Eric didn't recoil. He leaned closer, cradling the pottery like an infant, his face inches from the fracture. His breath fogged the clay. "It's hatching." The line widened with a brittle snap. Dust sifted down like ash. And then, faint but undeniable, something inside shifted. Not a scrape this time, a shove, a push against the walls of its prison. I staggered back, my mind screaming at me to smash it, to end it, to do anything but stand there watching. But my feet refused to move. The inevitable had arrived, and it was breaking through. The pottery cracked open in Eric's hands with a brittle snap, centuries of silence breaking in an instant. From the split, it crawled out. It wasn't larger than my thumb, yet it carried the weight of something prehistoric, something that belonged to a world long buried. Its shell gleamed with that unnatural kind of black that swallowed light, each joint clicking as it unfolded, spindly legs tipped in hooked claws. The wings on its back twitched uselessly, like shriveled reminders of what it once had been. And its mouth, God help me, its mouth wasn't built for this world. It opened sideways, jagged, glass-like, mandibles snapping with a hunger that felt older than language. It lunged at Eric before I could even move. The mandibles sank into his wrist, tearing raggedly through skin and muscle. His scream tore through the room, raw and panicked, as blood pulsed from the wound. Not spilling, but surging, thick and eager, as though pulled out by the insect itself. Eric flung his arm, and the thing clattered to the floor. With a snarl of disgust, he crushed it under his boot, its shell bursting with a sickening crack, black ichor seeping across the workshop floor. For one terrible moment, I thought that was it, that the nightmare was over as quickly as it had begun. But the true horror had already sunk its teeth into him. Eric staggered back, clutching his wrist. The bite had blackened almost instantly, veins writhing beneath the skin like worms desperate to crawl free. His face drained of color as sweat poured down his brow, his breath coming shallow, frantic. "Frank?" he gasped, but the word broke into a guttural cry. His pupils shrank to pinpricks drowned in red. His lips trembled, spittle mixing with blood, as if his body no longer obeyed him. I'd seen infections before. My father had once lost a finger to a rusted blade, but this wasn't infection. This was possession. And it was fast, too fast. Eric's scream collapsed into a wet moan as his knees buckled. He hit the floor hard, convulsing, hands clawing at nothing. For a heartbeat he went still, his chest rising in sharp, shallow gasps. I dropped to my knees, gripping his shoulders, shouting his name, begging him to hold on. Then his eyes snapped open. They weren't Eric's eyes anymore. The whites had gone murky, threaded with veins that spread like ink and water. Blood seeped across them in jagged patterns, drowning the man I knew beneath. His jaw slackened, then opened wide, and the stench that poured out wasn't breath. It was rot. Old, festering rot, like the air from a coffin cracked open after too long in the ground. That was the moment I understood. The bug wasn't just a parasite. It was a herald, a carrier of something far worse. And Eric wasn't mine to save anymore. My mind screamed at me to do something, call an ambulance, fetch a bandage, shout for help. But my body stayed rooted, frozen in the glow of the desk lamp, staring down at my best friend as if the very laws of nature had come undone at my feet. Eric twitched, chest heaving, his eyes rolling back before they snapped forward again, fixed on me. The blood-threaded whites were no longer his, not in color, not in intent. His mouth opened, dragging a sound from deep inside that wasn't language, wasn't even human. It was hunger. The sound vibrated through me, a low, ragged growl followed by a snapping of teeth. My breath caught. I whispered his name, Eric, as if that would bring him back, as if saying it might anchor him to who he had been seconds ago. But the man I knew was gone. With a guttural roar, he surged up from the floor, lunging at me with a ferocity I'd only ever seen in cornered animals. Instinct finally snapped me loose. I stumbled back, my hand flying toward the shelves where our collection lay scattered. Blades dulled by centuries, shields that had crumbled under time, weapons that hadn't seen battle in hundreds of years. My fingers closed on the first thing they found. Candlestick. Bronze green with age. It wasn't sharp anymore, but it was heavy, solid. Eric crashed into me, his weight knocking me into the workbench. His teeth snapped inches from my throat, the stench of rot pouring into my face. I shoved the dagger between us, pressing the hilt against his chest, his blood slicking my hands. "Stop!" The word tore out of me, though I knew it was pointless. He snarled, pushing harder, his strength wild, unnatural. The bronze dug into his shoulder, useless against the force driving him forward. I kicked at the floor, straining, and my heel struck another relic, a shield, its iron rim jagged where rust had eaten it. I didn't think. I grabbed it, swung with all the panic boiling inside me. The rim caught him across the face with a crunch. Eric reeled back, blood and spit flying from his mouth. The moan that followed was wet, animal, mindless. He didn't even pause. He came again. This time, I was ready. I raised the shield, bracing myself as his body slammed into it. My knees buckled, the weight nearly driving me down, but I held, screaming through clenched teeth as I shoved him backward. His arms clawed at the rim, fingers curling, blood dripping onto the workshop floor. The man who'd once shared drinks with me in dusty markets, who'd slept beside me on stone floors in faraway ruins, who'd laughed louder than anyone I knew, was now a monster trying to tear me apart. and I realized, with a sick twist in my gut, that the pottery hadn't been our greatest find. It had been our curse. Thanks for listening. If you want to survive the apocalypse, like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. What would you do to survive this?